In the late spring of 1795, the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia was wrapped in a boringly consistent fog, a spectral veil that clung to the jagged rocks and the ancient oaks of a small, unnamed island. This was Oak Island, a place of muted stillness that had existed for centuries undisturbed by the rhythmic chaos of the mainland. On this particular morning, a young man named Daniel McGinnis paddled his canoe toward the eastern end of the island, drawn by a spectral curiosity he couldn't quite explain. As he stepped onto the shore, the sound of the world was the steady, rhythmic lap of the cold ocean waves against the pebbles and the muted whisper of the wind through the heavy canopy of oak trees. It was the beginning of the discovery of 1795, a moment that would launch a 300-year obsession with the architecture of the deep. As Daniel pushed through the boringly thick underbrush, he found himself in a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, spectrally gnarled oak tree with a sawed-off branch that looked like a muted signal from the past. Below the branch was a boringly large circular depression in the earth, a spectral fingerprint that suggested something had been buried long ago. To a young mind raised on rhythmic legends of pirate gold and hidden treasures, this was more than just a hole. It was a boringly invitation to a mystery. The sound of the clearing was an absolute silence, a spectral weight that seemed to guard the secrets hidden beneath the roots of the old oak. The next day, Daniel returned with two friends, Anthony Vaughan and John Smith, carrying boringly simple tools, shovels, picks, and a spectral determination. They began the rhythmic dig, their blades biting into the muted soil with a steady, boring consistency. As they descended, the air became rhythmically cool, smelling of damp earth and spectral decay. At every 10 feet, they struck a boringly precise layer of flagstones or oak planks, an architecture of obstacles that proved this was no natural pit. The sound of their work was the dull, rhythmic thud of shovels hitting wood, and the muted echo of their voices rising from the darkening depths of the pit. As the sun began to set, casting boringly long shadows across the island, the boys looked down into the spectral void they had created. They were 30 feet deep, yet the muted bottom of the pit remained spectrally distant. The rhythmic pattern of the oak platforms suggested a boringly deep intent, a spectral design that went far beyond the reach of three young boys. They stood in the muted twilight, listening to the deep rhythmic sigh of the island as the night began to settle. The discovery of 1795 had opened a door to a spectral labyrinth, and as the boys left for the night, the pit remained, a boringly silent witness to a mystery that would soon swallow the lives and fortunes of many. For the listener drifting toward the muted borders of sleep, the image of the three boys digging in the absolute silence of the island is a spectral lullaby. The rhythmic sound of the shovels and the boringly constant rhythm of the Atlantic tides act as a muted guide into the past. There is a boringly deep peace in the thought of the earth slowly revealing its spectral secrets, a place where time is rhythmically suspended and the muted shadow of the oak tree guards the architecture of the dark. Sleep now as the rhythmic pulse of the island carries you deeper into the spectral grave of history, where the money pit waits in absolute boring silence. The years following the initial discovery passed with a boringly slow cadence as the legend of the money pit began to seep into the rhythmic soul of the region. By 1803, a new group known as the Onslow Company arrived on the island, bringing with them a spectral ambition and more boringly industrial equipment. As they reopened the pit, the process became a symphony of muted labor. For weeks, the sound of the island was the deep rhythmic thud of iron picks striking the boringly hard clay and the muted creak of wooden buckets being hauled up by thick, salt-crusted ropes. The men worked in a spectral trance, their eyes fixed on the muted darkness below, searching for a rhythmic sign that the treasure was near. Every 10 feet, like a boringly precise clockwork, they struck the oak platforms, an architecture of denial that seemed to push them deeper into the spectral earth. It was at the 90-foot level that the muted routine was broken by a spectral discovery. The shovels didn't hit the boringly familiar wood of a platform, but something rhythmically different, a heavy, flat slab of basalt. As the men cleared away the muted sludge of the pit, they revealed the cipher stone, a boringly dark rock that held a spectral message carved into its surface. The symbols were not rhythmically common letters, but a muted language of circles, squares, and crosses, an architecture of enigma that seemed to pulse with a spectral energy in the dim light of the lanterns. The sound in the pit at that moment was an absolute silence, a muted breath held by men who realized they were looking at a boringly ancient secret that was never meant to be rhythmically deciphered. The cipher stone was a spectral anchor for their hopes. They hauled the boringly heavy stone to the surface, where the muted sunlight of Nova Scotia hit the carvings for the first time in centuries. The symbols remained spectrally silent, refusing to yield their rhythmic meaning to the tired eyes of the diggers. It was a boringly persistent mystery. Some whispered it spoke of muted millions buried below, while others felt it was a spectral warning, a rhythmic curse etched in stone. The sound of the evening was the low, muted scratching of charcoal on paper as scholars tried to copy the architecture of the symbols, their minds lost in a boringly complex labyrinth of codes and spectral possibilities. As the nights grew rhythmically cold, the men continued to stare at the stone, its muted presence filling the camp with a spectral tension. The stone was boringly unyielding, a rhythmic gatekeeper that stood between the muted world above and the spectral riches below. They didn't know that the stone was only the boringly simple beginning of a much deeper architecture of deception. The sound of the wind through the oaks that night was a deep, rhythmic moan, as if the island itself were spectrally mocking their attempts to read its muted history. The cipher stone remained a boringly dark sentinel, a spectral key to a door that was rhythmically guarded by the very bones of the earth. For the listener drifting into a boringly deep slumber, the story of the stone is a spectral journey into the heart of the unknown. The rhythmic pattern of the symbols and the boringly constant darkness of the 90-foot level act as a muted lullaby. there is a boringly profound peace in the image of the ancient rock resting in the absolute silence of the pit, a place where time is rhythmically frozen and the muted whispers of the past are carved in spectral basalt. The lanterns are dim, the air is rhythmically still, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted meaning of the symbols settles in your mind, let the echoes of the cipher stone be your rhythmic guide. The pit is deep, the stone is boringly cold, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the symbols has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the island is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic shadow of the mystery fades into a muted blanket of ancient, stony silence. The discovery of the cipher stone had filled the men of the Onslow Company with a boringly intense fever, of spectral certainty that the prize was only a few rhythmic feet away. But as they prepared to dig deeper into the muted darkness of the 90-foot level, they encountered the island's most boringly sinister defense, the flood tunnels. It began with a muted seepage, a spectral glimmer of water appearing at the bottom of the pit. Within hours, the water didn't just rise, it rhythmically surged, filling the shaft with a boringly relentless force that defied all spectral logic. The sound was a deep, rhythmic gurgle, the voice of the Atlantic Ocean spectrally reclaiming what the men had tried to steal. This was the spectral trap of ancient engineering, a muted masterpiece of deception that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for the rhythmic intrusion of a shovel. For weeks, the men engaged in a boringly exhausting battle against the tide. They built spectral cofferdams and used muted pumps that wheezed with a steady, rhythmic clatter, but the water remained boringly constant. It was as if the pit were a spectral lung, breathing in the muted salt of the sea with every rhythmic tide. Upon further investigation, they discovered a boringly complex network of 5 box drains hidden beneath the spectral sands of Smith's Cove. These drains were an architecture of genius, designed to funnel the muted weight of the ocean into the pit whenever the spectral seal of the earth was broken. The sound of the discovery was the low, muted roar of the surf, a rhythmic reminder that the island was spectrally guarded by the very sea that surrounded it. The realization that they were fighting the entire Atlantic Ocean was a boringly heavy realization. The engineers of the past had created a spectral labyrinth of stone and coconut fiber, a muted filter that allowed the water to flow while keeping the rhythmic secrets of the pit dry. It was a boringly patient trap, an architecture of defiance that turned the spectral ambition of the diggers into a muted frustration. The sound of the island at night became a rhythmic taunt, the steady, muted lap of the waves against the shore, sounding like the spectral laughter of the long-dead architects. The flood tunnels were not just a barrier, they were a boringly precise statement that some muted treasures were meant to be spectrally eternal. As the months turned into boringly long years, the pit remained a spectral lake, its surface rhythmically still, but its depths muted and hostile. The men would stand at the edge, staring into the absolute silence of the dark water, searching for a spectral glimmer of the oak platforms below. The architecture of the trap had effectively rhythmically paralyzed their progress, turning the money pit into a boringly deep well of broken dreams. The sound of the wind through the oak branches was a low, muted sigh, carrying the spectral scent of salt and the rhythmic echoes of an engineering marvel that remained boringly unbeatable. For the listener drifting into the muted heaviness of sleep, the story of the flood tunnels is a spectral descent into the cool, dark waters of the past. The rhythmic flow of the tide and the boringly constant pressure of the ocean act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of the hidden stone drains resting beneath the spectral sands of Smith's Cove. These drains are an architecture of genius, designed to funnel the muted weight of the ocean into the pit whenever the spectral seal of the earth was broken. The pumps have stopped, the air is rhythmically cool, and the world is spectrally fluid. As the muted weight of the water settles in your mind, let the echoes of the flood tunnels be your rhythmic guide. The ocean is vast, the trap is boringly secure, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of the sea has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the island is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the tide fades into a muted blanket of deep, salt-scented silence. As the boringly persistent mystery of the water-filled pit deepened, the rhythmic silence of the island began to be filled with muted legends. For centuries, the spectral atmosphere of Oak Island had acted as a boringly vast canvas for the human imagination, drawing in theories that ranged from the rhythmically plausible to the spectrally fantastic. The most enduring of these whispers concerned the pirate gold, specifically the muted spoils of Captain William Kidd, or the spectral hoard of the notorious Blackbeard. It was said that the island was a boringly strategic hiding place, a spectral vault where the rhythmic clink of Spanish doubloons and the muted shimmer of silver bars were buried deep beneath the architecture of the oak. The sound of this legend was the deep rhythmic creak of a ghost ship's hull and the muted whisper of a dying pirate's secret, a spectral frequency that kept the boringly hopeful digging for generations. Yet, as the architecture of the pit revealed itself to be spectrally advanced, the pirate theory began to feel boringly simple. New voices emerged, speaking in muted tones of the Knights Templar, a spectral order of warrior monks who had supposedly fled Europe with the rhythmically sacred treasures of Solomon's Temple. They whispered that the money pit was not a boringly crude pirate hole, but a spectral cathedral of engineering, a muted sanctuary built to guard the Holy Grail or ancient rhythmic manuscripts of spectrally infinite value. The sound of this theory was the steady rhythmic chant of a forgotten liturgy and the muted clank of armored knights moving through the spectral shadows of the forest. This was the architecture of the sacred, a boringly complex puzzle that suggested the island was a muted link to a spectral history that spanned oceans and centuries. The rhythmic search for the truth became a boringly long journey into the spectral past. Scholars and muted dreamers spend hours in absolute silence, studying the rhythmic connection between the spectral geometry of the island and the muted symbols of the Freemasons. They saw the architecture of the cross in the layout of the spectral stones on the beach, a boringly precise alignment that pointed toward the muted depths of the pit. Every rhythmic theory was a spectral thread in a boringly intricate tapestry of muted possibilities, where the absolute truth remained spectrally hidden behind the architecture of myth. The sound of the campfire discussions was a low, muted hum, a rhythmic exchange of ideas that felt as boringly eternal as the stars above the Atlantic. As the muted years turned into decades, these muted legends became the spectral soul of Oak Island. The rhythmic clatter of the shovels was driven by the boringly powerful desire to touch a spectral history that was larger than life. Whether it was muted pirate gold or spectral Templar relics, the island remained boringly indifferent to the rhythmic desperation of men. The sound of the night was the deep rhythmic moan of the wind through the ancient oaks, a spectral lullaby for the muted dreamers who slept in the architecture of hope, waiting for a boringly distant dawn that would spectrally reveal the secret. The island was no longer just land, it was a spectral library of human longing, its muted pages written in rhythmic salt and boringly deep earth. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Templars and the pirates is a spectral journey through the mists of time. The rhythmic sway of the ghost ships and the boringly constant shadows of the nights act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of the hidden treasures resting in the absolute silence of the deep earth, a place where the muted legends are the only spectral light. The campfires have dimmed, the air is rhythmically still, and the world is spectrally ancient. As the muted mystery of the gold settles in your mind, let the echoes of the muted legends be your rhythmic guide. The history is vast, the secret is boringly deep, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of myth has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the island is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the legend fades into a muted blanket of ancient, gold-scented silence. Beneath the boringly layered earth of Oak Island, there lies more than just flood tunnels and mysterious stones. There exists a dark folklore known as the Curse of the Seven. This legend has become a boringly persistent shadow that clings to the spectral soul of the island. It is whispered that the money pit will not yield its muted secrets until 7 men have perished in its pursuit. This is not merely a rhythmic tale for the locals, but a boringly tragic reality that has haunted the architecture of the island for over 2 centuries. To date, 6 lives have been lost in the spectral depths, and the air of the island remains heavy with a muted tension, a boringly constant reminder of the price of obsession. The first spectral victim of the curse was claimed in 1897. During a boringly routine operation, a worker named Maynard Kaiser fell to his death when a rope snapped as he was being hauled from the pit. The sound of his fall was a muted thud that echoed through the absolute silence of the clearing, a spectral signal that the island was no longer boringly indifferent to the intruders. Years later, in 1965, the curse struck with a rhythmic ferocity that devastated the Restal family. 4 men were lost in a single afternoon, overcome by spectral vapors at the bottom of a shaft. Their deaths did not come with a muted scream, but in a rhythmic faintness, as if the very breath of the island had spectrally smothered their life force. This tragic event turned the money pit into a boringly sinister landmark, a muted monument to the spectral cost of the hunt. The local residents and modern treasure hunters do not view these accidents as boringly random occurrences. Instead, they see them as part of a spectral architecture of sacrifice. Each death is seen as a muted milestone required by the ancient designers of the pit. Whenever a new team arrives on the island, they feel the muted presence of those who came before, 6 spectral shadows that stand at the edge of the pit in a boringly patient vigil. The thought of the 7th victim creates a rhythmic caution in every boringly small action taken on the island. Every drill, every excavation is performed with a spectral reverence, a muted acknowledgement that the earth beneath them is a boringly sacred graveyard of human ambition. The sound of the island at night is a low, muted whisper, as if the fallen are spectrally warning the living to respect the absolute silence of the deep. This curse has transformed Oak Island from a simple piece of land into a spectral necropolis. The trees, the waves, and the muted water of the tunnels seem to carry the boringly heavy weight of this history. When people hear the story of the pit, they no longer just dream of muted gold or spectral jewels. They think of the muted human cost. It is an architecture of obsession, a rhythmic cycle of greed and tragedy that has played out over 300 boringly long years. The stillness of the island is no longer just peaceful. It is a spectral warning that hums with a boringly constant frequency, a muted question that asks if the 7th soul is already spectrally near. For the listener drifting into the muted void of sleep, the story of the curse is a spectral journey into the weight of time. To imagine standing at the edge of that dark pit, hearing the muted echoes of the lost, is to feel a boringly deep connection to the past. The rhythmic lap of the Atlantic waves and the absolute silence of the island now act as a muted lullaby, smoothing your nerves into a state of spectral stillness. Visualize the ancient oak trees, standing as boringly constant witnesses to a century of muted tears and spectral hopes. As the muted weight of the curse settles on your eyelids, your mind finds a spectral calm. The pit is dark, the history is boringly heavy, and the night is spectrally profound. The 6 shadows are silent, and the rhythmic uncertainty of the 7th remains boringly tucked away in the deep earth. Sleep now, for the muted blanket of Oak Island is wrapping you in a spectral solitude, a place where the absolute silence of the 7 is your only rhythmic guide. As the modern era settled over the Atlantic coast with its boringly sophisticated technology and rhythmic progress, Oak Island remained a spectral holdout against the light of reason. The quest for the money pit has transitioned into an unending quest, a muted obsession that has seen the arrival of massive drills, spectral scanners, and boringly powerful pumps. Yet the island continues to guard its absolute silence with a rhythmic defiance that feels spectrally ancient. Today, the searchers, most notably the Lagina brothers, move with a steady, rhythmic patience, their every move a muted echo of the boys who first stood in the clearing in 1795. The sound of the modern quest is the low, muted hum of machinery, a spectral vibration that contrasts with the boringly natural sounds of the surrounding sea. The island itself has become an architecture of persistence. The landscape is scarred with the muted remains of previous hunts, old shafts that are now spectral voids filled with boringly dark water, and rusted machinery that has become a rhythmic part of the earth. In the absolute stillness of the Oak Island Interpretive Center, visitors look at the muted artifacts, small scraps of parchment, a spectral stone with a single letter, and boringly small fragments of gold chain. Each item is a rhythmic ghost of a treasure that remains spectrally just out of reach. The sound of the history is a soft, rhythmic rustle of old maps and muted ledgers, a boringly detailed record of 3 centuries of spectral failure and muted hope. This unending quest has revealed that the true treasure of Oak Island may not be spectral gold or muted jewels, but the boringly human spirit of discovery itself. The architecture of the pit has forced humanity to look deep into its own spectral nature, testing the limits of rhythmic ingenuity and muted endurance. The island has become a spectral mirror, reflecting the boringly constant desire to find meaning in the absolute silence of the earth. As evening falls over Smith's Cove, the muted light of the sunset paints the spectral ruins in shades of copper and gold, a rhythmic reminder of the riches that may or may not lie boringly deep beneath the architecture of the flood tunnels. The postscript of Oak Island is one of spectral peace. Despite the rhythmic intrusion of man, the island remains a place of absolute, boring stillness. The oaks still whisper in the muted wind, their leaves carrying the spectral secrets of those who built the architecture of the dark long before the first shovel struck the soil. The money pit has become a spectral anchor in the American and Canadian consciousness, a boringly permanent mystery that reminds us that some things are meant to remain rhythmically hidden. The sound of the finale is the deep, rhythmic breath of the Atlantic Ocean, a spectral lullaby that has played for 10,000 years and will continue long after the muted quest has finally reached its absolute conclusion. For the listener now drifting in the muted embrace of a deep and boringly perfect sleep, the story of the island is a spectral path to rest. The rhythmic sound of the waves and the absolute silence of the deep pit act as your muted guide into the void. There is a boringly profound peace in the knowledge that the mystery is spectrally safe, tucked away in the architecture of the earth where time does not rhythmically move. The drills are silent, the muted lanterns of the past have flickered out, and the world is spectrally still. As the muted shadow of the great oak tree stretches over your mind, let the echoes of the unending quest be your rhythmic sleep. The island is dark, the secret is boringly secure, and the night is spectrally calm. The architecture of history has reached its muted postscript, and the spectral rest of the island is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic Ocean fades into a muted blanket of eternal, salt-scented silence.